Francisco Pizarro remains one of the most significant yet controversial figures of the age of exploration. As a Spanish conquistador, he is best known for leading the expedition that resulted in the downfall of the Inca Empire, reshaping the history of South America. His actions contributed to the expansion of the Spanish Empire and the widespread colonization of the New World. However, his legacy is marked by both admiration for his achievements and criticism for the brutality of his conquests. Understanding Pizarro's story requires examining his life, motivations, and the historical consequences of his actions. The early 16th century was a time of unprecedented exploration and expansion for European powers, particularly Spain and Portugal. The discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus in 1492 had set off a wave of exploration, leading to the conquest of vast territories by ambitious individuals. These explorers, known as conquistadors, sought wealth, glory, and power, often at the expense of indigenous civilizations. Pizarro was one of many who ventured into uncharted lands in search of riches, driven by personal ambition and the broader imperial goals of Spain. Pizarro's conquest of the Inca Empire was not an isolated event, but part of a larger pattern of European expansion and colonization. Similar to Hernán Cortés's conquest of the Aztec Empire in Mexico, Pizarro's campaign in Peru relied on a combination of military force, political manipulation, and alliances with indigenous groups. His success was facilitated by internal divisions within the Inca Empire, which was already weakened by a civil war between two rival brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar. This political instability provided an opportunity for the Spanish to exploit the situation to their advantage. The Spanish conquest of Peru had profound consequences, both immediate and long-term. In the short term, it led to the rapid dismantling of the Inca state and the establishment of Spanish colonial rule. The indigenous population suffered immensely due to warfare, forced labor, and the introduction of European diseases such as smallpox. In the long term, the conquest facilitated the integration of the Andean region into the global economy through the exploitation of resources, particularly silver from the mines of Potosí. The Spanish presence reshaped the cultural, political, and economic landscape of South America, leaving a legacy that continues to be debated by historians. Despite his role in shaping history, Pizarro remains a controversial figure. To some, he is remembered as a skilled military strategist and leader who achieved remarkable feats with a small force against a vast empire. To others, he is viewed as a ruthless opportunist whose actions led to the destruction of a sophisticated civilization. This duality makes him an intriguing subject of historical study, as his legacy is neither entirely heroic nor wholly villainous. Pizarro's life and career illustrate the complexities of European expansion in the Americas. His journey from an obscure background in Spain to the heights of power in the New World reflects the opportunities and dangers of the age. Like many conquistadors, he operated in an environment where ambition, violence, and political cunning determined success or failure. His ability to navigate these challenges ultimately allowed him to achieve his goals, though at great cost to the indigenous peoples he encountered. It is also important to consider the broader implications of Pizarro's conquest. The Spanish colonization of Peru set a precedent for how European powers would govern their overseas territories. The encomienda system, which allowed Spanish settlers to exploit indigenous labor, became a cornerstone of colonial rule. The forced conversion of native populations to Christianity further exemplified the cultural transformation imposed by the Spanish. These policies created lasting inequalities that shaped the development of Latin America for centuries to come. In examining Pizarro's story, one must also recognize the perspectives of the indigenous peoples who resisted Spanish rule. While Pizarro and his men succeeded in overthrowing the Inca elite, they faced continued resistance from local populations. Figures such as Manco Inca, who led a rebellion against Spanish rule, demonstrate that the conquest was not a simple process of European domination, but a complex struggle with multiple actors and consequences. The story of Francisco Pizarro is one of ambition, conquest, and controversy. His actions changed the course of history, altering the fate of an entire civilization. While his achievements were significant, they came at a heavy price, raising ethical and moral questions about the nature of conquest and colonialism. By studying Pizarro's life and legacy, we gain insight into the dynamics of European imperialism and the lasting effects of the Spanish presence in the Americas. Francisco Pizarro's early life remains shrouded in mystery, with many details lost to time or distorted by later accounts. What is known, however, is that he was born around 1478 in Trujillo, a small town in the Extremadura region of Spain. This region was known for its harsh living conditions, economic hardships, and a history of producing ambitious explorers and conquistadors, including Hernán Cortés. Pizarro's humble origins and lack of formal education played a significant role in shaping his character and motivations, particularly his relentless pursuit of wealth and power in the New World. Pizarro was the illegitimate son of Gonzalo Pizarro, a Spanish soldier who had served under the Catholic monarchs Ferdinand and Isabella. His mother, Francisca González, was of lower social status, and as a result, Pizarro was not afforded the privileges of nobility. Unlike many of his contemporaries who received formal training in literacy, governance, and military tactics, Pizarro grew up illiterate and worked as a swineherd in his youth. This upbringing likely instilled in him a sense of resilience and self-reliance, qualities that would later define his leadership style and approach to conquest. Despite his lack of noble status, Pizarro was born into a time of great change and opportunity. The unification of Spain, the completion of the Reconquista, and the discovery of the Americas opened new avenues for social mobility. Many young men from poor backgrounds sought to escape the limitations of their birth by embarking on voyages of exploration and conquest. The promise of wealth and adventure in the New World was particularly attractive to those with few prospects in Spain. Little is known about Pizarro's early military experience, but it is believed that he served as a soldier in Italy under the Spanish army before making his way to the Americas. During this period, Spain was engaged in several conflicts, including wars in Italy, where its forces honed the use of gunpowder weapons and battlefield tactics that would later prove instrumental in the conquest of indigenous civilizations. Pizarro's exposure to military life likely provided him with the skills necessary to lead men in battle, though he lacked the formal training of a noble officer. In 1502, Pizarro traveled to the New World, following in the footsteps of many Spanish adventurers who sought their fortunes in the newly discovered lands. He initially arrived in Hispaniola, modern-day Dominican Republic and Haiti, where the Spanish had established one of their first major colonies. Like many newcomers, he likely engaged in various roles, from soldier to administrator, gaining valuable experience in colonial affairs and indigenous relations. His time in the Caribbean would serve as the foundation for his later ambitions to explore and conquer more distant lands. Pizarro's first major opportunity for advancement came when he joined an expedition to Panama in 1513, led by Vasco Núñez de Balboa. This expedition was significant because it resulted in the first European sighting of the Pacific Ocean, a discovery that would later influence Pizarro's decision to explore the western coast of South America. Balboa's venture demonstrated that vast, unexplored territories lay beyond the known world, fueling the imaginations of ambitious men like Pizarro. His participation in the expedition established his reputation as a capable explorer, aligning him with powerful figures in the Spanish colonial administration. As Spanish settlements expanded across the Isthmus of Panama, Pizarro grew in prominence. He gained wealth through land ownership and the exploitation of indigenous labor, as was common among conquistadors. However, he remained restless, eager for greater riches and glory. His experiences in Panama exposed him to stories of a great empire to the south, a land filled with gold and advanced civilizations. These tales, combined with his personal ambition, motivated him to seek an expedition to explore the unknown lands beyond the Pacific coast. Unlike many of his contemporaries who relied on noble birth or royal favor to achieve success, Pizarro's rise was marked by persistence and alliances with powerful figures. One of his most important partnerships was with Diego de Almagro, a fellow soldier and explorer. Together, they began planning an expedition to the lands rumored to contain immense wealth. However, their lack of official backing and resources meant that their initial efforts were fraught with difficulty, forcing them to rely on personal investments and persuasion to gather support. Pizarro's early life and experiences in the New World highlight the qualities that would define his later career: ambition, resilience, and a willingness to take risks. Unlike the educated and strategic Hernán Cortés, Pizarro's success would rely more on brute force, adaptability, and sheer determination. His ability to endure hardships, forge alliances, and manipulate political situations made him a formidable leader, even if his methods were often ruthless. As Pizarro set his sights on South America, he embarked on a journey that would change the course of history. Francisco Pizarro's first voyages to the New World were instrumental in shaping his ambitions and preparing him for the conquest of the Inca Empire. Unlike some of his contemporaries, such as Hernán Cortés, who quickly rose to prominence through a single decisive campaign, Pizarro's path to fame was gradual and filled with hardships. His experiences in the Caribbean and Central America not only provided him with valuable military and administrative skills, but also exposed him to the methods of conquest and colonization that the Spanish had already begun to implement in the Americas. Pizarro's journey to the New World began in 1502 when he accompanied Nicolas de Ovando, the newly appointed governor of Hispaniola. At the time, the Spanish were consolidating their rule over the indigenous Taino population, using a combination of military force and the encomienda system, which granted Spanish settlers the right to extract labor and tribute from native communities. This brutal system of exploitation foreshadowed the tactics that Pizarro and other conquistadors would later employ in their own campaigns. During his time in Hispaniola, Pizarro likely participated in the suppression of indigenous resistance and the expansion of Spanish settlements. However, his ambitions extended beyond the Caribbean islands, which had already been largely conquered and colonized by the early 16th century. Like many other adventurers, he sought opportunities on the mainland, where vast territories remained unexplored and, more importantly, where rumors of great wealth continued to circulate. In 1513, Pizarro joined Vasco Núñez de Balboa on an expedition that would prove to be a defining moment in Spanish exploration. Balboa, having heard of a great ocean beyond the mountains of Panama, led a small force across the isthmus and became the first European to lay eyes on the Pacific Ocean. This discovery was of immense strategic importance, as it suggested that the Spanish could access new lands and trade routes beyond the Atlantic. Pizarro's participation in this expedition gave him first-hand knowledge of the geography and potential of the western coast of the Americas, planting the seeds for his later ambitions in South America. Despite Balboa's groundbreaking discovery, political intrigue soon engulfed the Spanish administration in Panama. Balboa fell out of favor with Pedrarias de Villa, the newly appointed governor, who viewed him as a rival. Pizarro, ever pragmatic and opportunistic, sided with Pedrarias and played a role in Balboa's arrest and execution in 1519. This event demonstrated Pizarro's ability to navigate the dangerous political landscape of the Spanish colonies, aligning himself with those in power rather than remaining loyal to his former commander. His decision to support Pedrarias not only ensured his survival, but also positioned him for greater responsibilities in the expanding Spanish territories. As a reward for his loyalty, Pizarro was granted land and a position of authority in Panama, where he worked as an administrator and soldier. However, despite these privileges, he was not content with the relatively meager opportunities available in the colony. Reports of rich civilizations further south, brought by indigenous traders and Spanish explorers, fueled his desire to embark on an expedition of his own. These rumors spoke of a great empire where gold and silver were abundant, an empire that would later be identified as the Inca civilization. The idea of exploring South America was not unique to Pizarro. Other Spanish adventurers had attempted similar expeditions, but most had ended in failure due to harsh conditions, lack of supplies, and resistance from indigenous populations. The jungles and coastlines of South America were largely uncharted, presenting enormous logistical challenges for any expedition. Despite these difficulties, Pizarro, along with his trusted companions Diego de Almagro and Hernando de Luque, resolved to pursue the rumored wealth of the South. Between 1524 and 1528, Pizarro led two preliminary expeditions along the Pacific coast of present-day Colombia and Ecuador. These journeys were fraught with hardship, as the Spanish encountered hostile environments, food shortages, and violent resistance from indigenous groups. The first expedition, in particular, was a disaster, with many of Pizarro's men succumbing to disease, starvation, and attacks. Despite these setbacks, the explorers caught glimpses of gold ornaments and heard further accounts of a wealthy civilization deeper inland. These small but tantalizing discoveries convinced Pizarro that the risks were worth taking. Determined to launch a more ambitious expedition, Pizarro returned to Spain in 1528 to seek royal approval from King Charles I. He understood that without official backing, he would lack the legitimacy and resources needed to mount a large-scale conquest. His audience with the king proved successful, as he was granted a royal charter authorizing him to claim new territories for Spain and govern any lands he conquered. This marked a turning point in his career, as he now had the legal authority to pursue the conquest of the Inca Empire. Pizarro's first voyages to the New World illustrate the persistence and ambition that defined his character. Unlike some conquistadors who achieved quick victories, Pizarro spent decades learning, adapting, and carefully positioning himself for success. His experiences in Hispaniola, Panama, and along the Pacific coast gave him the knowledge and determination needed to embark on what would become one of the most consequential expeditions in history. Francisco Pizarro's journey to Peru was the culmination of years of preparation, ambition, and perseverance. After his initial explorations along the Pacific coast, he became convinced that a great and wealthy empire lay further south. However, to reach and conquer this land, he needed not only men and supplies, but also the legal authority to claim territories for Spain. His return to Spain in 1528 was a crucial step in securing the necessary royal backing for what would become one of the most significant conquests in history. Upon arriving in Spain, Pizarro presented his findings to King Charles I, emphasizing the wealth and potential of the lands he had briefly explored. The Spanish monarchy, eager to expand its empire and increase its access to gold and silver, saw potential in Pizarro's proposal. As a result, on July 26, 1529, Queen Isabella of Portugal, acting on behalf of King Charles, signed the Capitulation of Toledo. This document granted Pizarro the right to conquer and govern the lands he would claim in the name of Spain. He was officially given the title of governor, captain general, and adelantado of Peru, while his associates Diego de Almagro and Hernando de Luque received lesser rewards. This unequal division of power would later lead to significant conflicts among the conquistadors. With the royal charter secured, Pizarro returned to Panama to prepare for his expedition. However, gathering men, ships, and supplies proved difficult, as many in the colony were reluctant to embark on such a dangerous journey. The hardships of Pizarro's previous expeditions were well known, and the prospect of venturing into unknown and hostile territories deterred many potential recruits. Despite these challenges, Pizarro managed to assemble a small force of around 180 men, including several cavalry units, which would prove decisive in the battles to come. In 1531, Pizarro and his men set sail from Panama, landing on the coast of present-day Ecuador. The Spanish immediately encountered resistance from local indigenous groups, who fought fiercely to defend their lands. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Pizarro's forces, armed with steel weapons, gunpowder, and horses, were able to defeat their adversaries. These early skirmishes demonstrated the technological and tactical advantages the Spanish held over indigenous forces, foreshadowing the battles that would later take place in the heart of the Inca Empire. As Pizarro's expedition moved southward, they began to encounter evidence of the Inca civilization's wealth and sophistication. They saw well-built roads, extensive irrigation systems, and thriving settlements, clear indications of a powerful and organized society. However, they also discovered signs of internal strife. The Inca Empire was in the midst of a devastating civil war between two brothers, Atahualpa and Huáscar, who were competing for the throne after the death of their father, Sapa Inca Huayna Capac. This internal conflict would become one of the key factors that enabled Pizarro to exploit divisions within the empire. By 1532, Pizarro's forces had reached the northern Inca city of Toms, where they were astonished by the wealth and structure of the society. However, they also noticed that the empire was weakened by years of warfare. The Spanish learned that Atahualpa had recently defeated Huáscar and had taken control of the empire, but his position was not yet fully secure. Atahualpa's focus was still on eliminating remaining resistance from Huáscar's supporters, leaving him unaware of the true threat that Pizarro and his small force posed. Recognizing an opportunity, Pizarro moved inland toward Cajamarca, a major city in the northern part of the Inca Empire. Along the way, he sent envoys to Atahualpa, presenting himself as an ambassador of Spain rather than as an invader. This deception was a key tactic used by the conquistadors, allowing them to gather intelligence and assess their enemy before launching an attack. Atahualpa, confident in his army of tens of thousands of warriors, saw no immediate danger in meeting with the Spanish. He agreed to a meeting in Cajamarca, setting the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations in the conquest of the Inca Empire. As Pizarro and his men entered Cajamarca in November 1532, they were met with an imposing sight. Thousands of Inca soldiers camped outside the city. However, the Spanish noted that Atahualpa's forces were unarmed, as they did not view the Spaniards as a significant military threat. The Inca ruler, believing in his divine authority, saw no reason to prepare for battle. Pizarro, recognizing the advantage this provided, began devising a plan to capture Atahualpa and neutralize the Inca leadership in a single decisive strike. Despite their small numbers, the Spanish had key advantages: their superior weaponry, horses, and the element of surprise. They also possessed another critical tool: diplomatic manipulation. Pizarro and his men, following the example of Hernán Cortés in Mexico, used deception and psychological tactics to instill confusion and fear among the indigenous population. They relied on interpreters to communicate with Atahualpa's officials, carefully crafting messages that reinforced their image as envoys of a powerful and divine ruler, the King of Spain. As the meeting between Pizarro and Atahualpa approached, tensions grew. Atahualpa remained confident in his power, while Pizarro prepared his men for an ambush that would change the fate of the Inca Empire forever. The conquest of Peru was no longer just a distant goal. It was now within reach. The events that unfolded in Cajamarca would mark the beginning of the end for the Incas and solidify Pizarro's place in history as one of the most ruthless and strategic conquistadors of his time. The capture of Atahualpa in November 1532 was one of the most pivotal moments in the conquest of the Inca Empire. It was a carefully orchestrated event that showcased Francisco Pizarro's strategic cunning and the technological advantages of the Spanish over the indigenous forces. Despite being vastly outnumbered, Pizarro and his men executed a plan that would ultimately lead to the downfall of one of the most powerful civilizations in the Americas. Atahualpa, fresh from his victory in the civil war against his brother Huáscar, was camped near the city of Cajamarca with an army of tens of thousands of warriors. Confident in his divine authority and military strength, he saw no immediate threat in the small band of Spanish explorers. Pizarro, on the other hand, recognized that a direct confrontation against such a large force would be suicidal. Instead, he devised a plan to lure Atahualpa into a false sense of security, using deception and superior weaponry to strike at the right moment. On November 15, 1532, Pizarro and his force of approximately 180 men entered Cajamarca, a small but strategically significant city in the northern Andes. They immediately set about preparing an ambush. The Spaniards positioned themselves inside buildings surrounding the main square, hiding their cavalry and artillery out of sight. Pizarro then sent a message to Atahualpa, inviting him to a meeting in the city's plaza. Believing that the Spaniards were no more than a group of diplomatic envoys, Atahualpa accepted the invitation and arrived the next day with a large entourage of unarmed nobles and attendants. As Atahualpa entered the plaza, he was approached by the Dominican friar Vicente de Valverde, who served as Pizarro's religious representative. Valverde presented Atahualpa with a Bible and a message demanding that he submit to the authority of the Spanish crown and convert to Christianity. Atahualpa, unfamiliar with the concept of a written religious text, is said to have examined the Bible, then discarded it, either out of confusion or disdain. This action provided the Spaniards with a pretext to initiate their attack. At that moment, Pizarro gave the signal for his men to strike. The Spanish forces, armed with muskets, cannons, and steel swords, unleashed a sudden and devastating assault on Atahualpa's unarmed entourage. The Inca warriors, unprepared for such an ambush, were thrown into chaos. The sound of gunfire and the sight of mounted Spanish cavalry, creatures unknown to the Incas, created widespread panic. The tightly packed crowd in the plaza made it nearly impossible for them to escape, and the Spanish slaughtered thousands within a matter of hours. Amid the carnage, Pizarro's primary objective was to capture Atahualpa alive, recognizing that controlling the emperor would provide him with immense leverage. Pizarro himself is said to have intervened to prevent Atahualpa from being killed in the chaos. After a brief struggle, the Inca ruler was seized and taken prisoner. With their leader in captivity, the remaining Inca forces outside the city hesitated to act, further sealing Pizarro's victory. The capture of Atahualpa was a psychological and political disaster for the Inca Empire. As the divine ruler, the Sapa Inca was considered the living son of the sun god, Inti. His sudden imprisonment shattered the morale of his followers and left the empire leaderless at a crucial moment. Pizarro understood the power Atahualpa still held and chose to keep him alive, using him as a puppet to maintain control over the empire while the Spanish consolidated their position. Realizing the Spaniards' insatiable hunger for gold, Atahualpa sought to negotiate his release by offering a ransom. In what would become one of the most famous ransoms in history, he promised to fill a large room, about 22 feet long and 17 feet wide, once with gold and twice with silver in exchange for his freedom. Over the next several months, Inca officials transported enormous quantities of treasure from across the empire, stripping temples, palaces, and tombs to meet the Spanish demand. By mid-1533, the ransom was complete, amounting to several tons of gold and silver, making it the largest ransom ever paid in history. However, despite Atahualpa's fulfillment of his promise, Pizarro had no intention of releasing him. The Spanish feared that if freed, Atahualpa would rally his remaining forces and drive them out. Additionally, tensions were rising within the Spanish camp, with Pizarro's men growing restless and eager to divide the vast wealth they had accumulated. Seeing Atahualpa as a liability, Pizarro and his advisors decided to eliminate him. In August 1533, Atahualpa was subjected to a mock trial, accused of treason, idolatry, and conspiring against the Spanish. He was sentenced to death by burning, but upon his conversion to Christianity, the sentence was changed to execution by garrote, strangulation. With Atahualpa's death, the Inca Empire was thrown into further disarray, allowing the Spanish to continue their conquest with minimal resistance. The capture and execution of Atahualpa marked a turning point in the Spanish conquest of Peru. By using deception, superior weaponry, and psychological warfare, Pizarro had achieved what once seemed impossible, bringing a mighty empire to its knees with a force of less than 200 men. The capture and execution of Atahualpa in 1533 marked a turning point in the Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire. However, Despite this victory, Francisco Pizarro and his men still faced significant challenges. The Inca resistance was not yet fully extinguished, and the Spanish had to secure control over the vast territories of the empire. The ultimate goal was the conquest of Cuzco, the capital and spiritual heart of the Inca civilization. By seizing this city, Pizarro aimed to solidify Spanish dominance and dismantle the last remnants of Inca authority. Following Atahualpa's death, the Spanish faced a critical decision regarding the leadership of the Inca people. Rather than abolishing the Inca monarchy outright, Pizarro installed Tupac Hualpa, a puppet ruler loyal to Spain, as the new Sapa Inca. This move was strategic, as it allowed the Spanish to maintain a semblance of continuity and legitimacy while they consolidated their power. However, Tupac Hualpa lacked the authority and support of his predecessor, and his rule was short-lived. He died under mysterious circumstances, likely poisoned by Inca nobles still loyal to the fallen Atahualpa. Despite the growing instability within the Inca leadership, Pizarro advanced toward Cuzco in late 1533. His forces, which included both Spanish soldiers and indigenous allies who opposed Inca rule, encountered resistance along the way. Many Inca warriors continued to fight against the invaders, particularly in the region around Vilcashuaman, where fierce battles took place. However, the internal divisions within the Inca Empire weakened their ability to mount a unified defense. The civil war between Atahualpa and Huáscar had left the empire fractured, and Pizarro skillfully exploited these divisions by forging alliances with rival factions. One of the most significant battles occurred at Jaja, where Pizarro's forces clashed with a determined Inca resistance. Despite being heavily outnumbered, the Spaniards' superior weapons, cavalry, and battlefield tactics allowed them to secure victory. This battle further demonstrated the military advantages that the Spanish possessed, particularly their ability to instill fear and confusion among indigenous forces through the use of firearms and horses, which were previously unknown in the Andes. As Pizarro's army continued its march toward Cuzco, the city itself was thrown into turmoil. The Incas, realizing the imminent threat, attempted to fortify their defenses. However, the absence of a strong, unifying leader following Atahualpa's execution left them vulnerable. By the time Pizarro reached the outskirts of Cuzco in November 1533, the defenders were already demoralized. On November 15, 1533, the Spanish launched their final assault on the city. The battle for Cuzco was intense, with Inca warriors using their knowledge of the terrain to their advantage. The city's layout, with its stone fortresses and narrow streets, made direct attacks difficult. However, the Spanish gradually pushed forward, aided by their indigenous allies who sought revenge against the ruling Inca elite. A crucial turning point in the battle was the capture of the Sacsayhuaman fortress, a key defensive stronghold overlooking the city. Once this fortress fell, Inca resistance crumbled. On November 15, 1533, Francisco Pizarro entered Cuzco as a conqueror. The city, which had served as the religious, political, and cultural center of the Inca Empire for centuries, was now under Spanish control. The conquistadors wasted no time in looting its riches, stripping temples and palaces of their gold and silver. The Coricancha, the most sacred temple dedicated to the sun god Inti, was ransacked, and its golden walls were melted down and divided among the Spanish. The conquest of Cuzco marked the definitive collapse of the Inca Empire as an independent political entity. Despite this monumental victory, Pizarro knew that Spanish rule was not yet fully secure. Resistance movements continued to emerge, and some Incan nobles fled into the rugged mountains, determined to fight another day. Recognizing the need for political stability, Pizarro sought to establish a Spanish-style government in Peru. He appointed his brother, Gonzalo Pizarro, as one of the key administrators and began the process of redistributing land among his men, following the encomienda system. To further cement Spanish authority, Pizarro founded the city of Lima in 1535, strategically located on the coast for easier access to Spanish supply routes. Lima would soon become the administrative capital of Spanish Peru, replacing Cuzco as the center of colonial governance. The establishment of Lima demonstrated Pizarro's vision for long-term control over the region, ensuring Spanish dominance over both the indigenous population and future settlers. Although Pizarro had successfully conquered the Inca capital, the struggle for control of Peru was far from over. In the coming years, resistance movements, led by the remaining Inca nobility, would challenge Spanish rule in a series of uprisings. The most notable of these was led by Manco Inca, who established a rebel stronghold in Vilcabamba and waged a guerrilla war against the Spaniards. However, the foundation of Spanish control had been firmly established, and the Incas, despite their resilience, would never regain their former power. The fall of Cuzco and the consolidation of Spanish rule in Peru marked the end of the Inca Empire and the beginning of a new colonial era. Francisco Pizarro had achieved what he had long sought, a vast territory rich in resources, ruled in the name of the Spanish crown. Yet, his success also sowed the seeds of future conflicts, both among the Spanish themselves and with the indigenous population that refused to accept foreign domination. Although Francisco Pizarro had successfully conquered the Inca Empire and established Spanish rule in Peru, his greatest challenges were yet to come. The spoils of conquest, gold, land, and power, ignited fierce rivalries among the Spanish conquerors, leading to betrayal and civil war. These conflicts, fought between former allies, would ultimately lead to Pizarro's downfall and the fragmentation of Spanish control in Peru. One of the key figures in this power struggle was Diego de Almagro, Pizarro's former partner in exploration and conquest. Almagro had played a crucial role in the early expeditions along the Pacific coast and had helped finance Pizarro's journey to Peru. However, the capitulation of Toledo, signed by the Spanish crown in 1529, granted Pizarro the governorship of the newly conquered lands, while Almagro received far less territory and authority. This unequal distribution of power became the root of the conflict between the two men. Tensions between Pizarro and Almagro escalated after the conquest of Cuzco. Almagro believed that he had a rightful claim to the city, arguing that it fell within the jurisdiction granted to him by the crown. Pizarro, however, refused to relinquish control of Cuzco, viewing it as the most important city in the Andean world. The dispute grew worse when Almagro, seeking new territories to govern, launched an expedition to Chile in 1535. Almagro's journey to Chile proved to be a disastrous miscalculation. Unlike the gold-rich lands of Peru, Chile offered little in terms of wealth, and his army suffered from harsh conditions, extreme weather, and a lack of resources. Disheartened by the failure of the expedition, Almagro returned to Peru in 1537, only to find that Pizarro had strengthened his grip on Cuzco. Furious and desperate, Almagro took the drastic step of seizing the city by force, capturing Pizarro's brothers, Hernando and Gonzalo. The situation erupted into full-scale civil war between the conquistadors. In 1538, Pizarro's forces, led by Hernando Pizarro, clashed with Almagro's troops in the Battle of Las Salinas, near Cuzco. The battle was brutal and decisive, with Pizarro's forces emerging victorious. Almagro was captured and later executed by garrote, a fate eerily similar to that of Atahualpa. His supporters, known as the Almagristas, swore revenge, ensuring that the cycle of violence among the Spanish conquerors would continue. Although Pizarro had eliminated his main rival, his troubles were far from over. The Spanish crown, watching these internal conflicts from afar, began to lose trust in the conquistadors' ability to govern effectively. Royal officials were increasingly sent to Peru to establish order and impose Spanish law, diminishing the autonomy that Pizarro had enjoyed in the early years of the conquest. Moreover, Almagro's followers, still embittered by their leader's execution, plotted to overthrow Pizarro and reclaim power for themselves. By 1541, opposition to Pizarro had reached a breaking point. The remaining Almagristas, led by Diego de Almagro the Younger, launched a rebellion against him. On June 26, 1541, a group of armed conspirators stormed Pizarro's palace in Lima. Despite being nearly 70 years old, Pizarro fought fiercely, reportedly killing several attackers before being overwhelmed. In a final, bloody confrontation, Francisco Pizarro was assassinated in his own home, bringing an end to the life of one of history's most ruthless and ambitious conquerors. Pizarro's death did not bring stability to Peru. Instead, it plunged the colony into further chaos. With both Pizarro and Almagro gone, new leaders emerged to continue the power struggle. The Spanish crown eventually imposed direct rule over Peru, sending Viceroy Blasco Núñez Vela in 1544 to enforce royal authority and suppress rebellion. However, the legacy of Pizarro's conquest left deep scars on the region, both for the indigenous population and for the Spanish settlers who fought among themselves for dominance. The civil war among the conquistadors revealed the underlying fragility of Spanish rule in the Americas. While the conquistadors had been united in their goal of plundering and conquering the Inca Empire, they were ultimately divided by greed and ambition. The absence of strong, centralized leadership led to violent infighting, weakening Spanish control and creating a period of instability that lasted for decades. Despite his brutal methods and controversial legacy, Francisco Pizarro remains one of the most significant figures in the history of the New World. His conquest of Peru reshaped the destiny of South America, bringing an end to the Inca civilization and ushering in an era of Spanish colonial rule. However, his downfall serves as a reminder that conquest alone is not enough to sustain power. Without unity and governance, even the most successful empires can fall into chaos. The assassination of Francisco Pizarro on June 26, 1541, marked a turning point in the history of Spanish rule in Peru. His death, however, did not bring peace or stability to the colony. Instead, it plunged the region into further conflict as various factions vied for control. The Spanish crown, increasingly alarmed by the disorder in its most lucrative overseas possession, intervened directly to restore order and assert royal authority. This chapter explores the chaotic aftermath of Pizarro's assassination, the final suppression of the conquistador factions, and the consolidation of Spanish colonial rule. Following Pizarro's death, Diego de Almagro the Younger, the son of the executed Diego de Almagro, briefly seized power in Lima with the support of his father's loyalists, known as the Almagristas. They viewed their victory as vengeance for the betrayal and execution of their leader years earlier. However, their control was short-lived. Many Spaniards, including some of Pizarro's former supporters, refused to accept Almagro's rule, recognizing that the Spanish crown would not tolerate such a rebellion. A decisive confrontation occurred in 1542 at the Battle of Chupa, where Almagro's forces were defeated by royalist troops led by Cristobal Vaca de Castro, a judge sent by the Spanish crown to restore order. Almagro the Younger was captured and executed, signaling the end of the long and bloody feud between the Pizarro and Almagro factions. This victory allowed the crown to reassert its control over Peru, but tensions between the conquistadors and royal officials persisted. Recognizing the need for stronger governance, the Spanish crown enacted the new laws of 1542, a set of regulations aimed at protecting the indigenous population from extreme exploitation under the encomienda system. The laws sought to limit the power of encomenderos, Spanish landowners who controlled indigenous labor, and phase out their hereditary rights to Indian labor. However, many conquistadors fiercely resisted these reforms, seeing them as a direct attack on their wealth and privileges. The enforcement of the new laws led to another major rebellion, this time led by Gonzalo Pizarro, Francisco Pizarro's younger brother. As one of the most powerful encomenderos in Peru, Gonzalo refused to accept the restrictions imposed by the Spanish crown. In 1544, he led a revolt against the newly appointed Viceroy Blasco Núñez Vela, who had arrived in Lima to implement the reforms. The conflict escalated into a full-scale civil war, culminating in the Battle of Aniquito in 1546, where Gonzalo Pizarro's forces defeated and executed the viceroy. For a brief period, Gonzalo Pizarro ruled Peru almost independently from Spain, effectively declaring himself the supreme authority in the colony. However, his defiance could not last. In 1548, the Spanish crown sent Pedro de la Gasca, a skilled diplomat and royal representative, to suppress the rebellion. Unlike his predecessors, de la Gasca adopted a strategic approach, winning the support of many Spanish settlers and turning former allies against Gonzalo Pizarro. The final confrontation occurred at the Battle of Jacuajuana in April 1548. By this point, Gonzalo Pizarro's forces had significantly weakened due to internal betrayals and diminishing support. De la Gasca's army easily overwhelmed the rebels, and Gonzalo was captured. Unlike his brother Francisco, who had been assassinated in an act of vengeance, Gonzalo was formally tried and executed for treason. His death marked the definitive end of the Pizarro family's influence in Peru. With the elimination of the conquistador factions, the Spanish crown was finally able to establish a stable colonial administration. The Viceroyalty of Peru was officially structured under direct royal control, with Lima as its capital. The encomienda system remained in place, but with stricter regulations, and indigenous uprisings were increasingly suppressed. The colonial government introduced a more organized system of taxation, legal institutions, and military oversight, ensuring that power remained firmly in the hands of the crown rather than individual adventurers. Although Spanish rule was now firmly consolidated, its impact on the indigenous population was devastating. The forced labor system, known as MITA, was widely used in mining operations, particularly in Potosí, where silver extraction became the backbone of the Spanish economy. Millions of indigenous people suffered under these exploitative conditions, leading to demographic collapse due to overwork, malnutrition, and European diseases. The destruction of Inca political and religious structures further contributed to the cultural erosion of native societies. The conquest of Peru, initially driven by individual ambitions like those of Francisco Pizarro and Diego de Almagro, had transformed into a rigid colonial system under Spanish rule. The violent struggles among the conquistadors had only delayed, but not prevented, the inevitable imposition of centralized governance by the Spanish crown. Ultimately, while Pizarro and his contemporaries had sought wealth and personal power, their conquests laid the foundation for over 300 years of Spanish dominance in South America. The conquest of the Inca Empire by Francisco Pizarro and his men was one of the most defining moments in the history of South America. Its consequences rippled across centuries, shaping the political, social, and economic structures of the region. While Pizarro himself was assassinated in 1541, his actions, and those of his fellow conquistadors, permanently altered the trajectory of Peruvian and Latin American history. The transformation of the former Inca lands into a Spanish colony set the foundation for an era of exploitation, cultural hybridization, and resistance that would persist well into the modern age. One of the most immediate and enduring consequences of the conquest was the imposition of Spanish rule over the Andean region. The viceroyalty system, formally established after the defeat of the Pizarro and Almagro factions, ensured that the Spanish crown maintained firm control over its American territories. Unlike the period of the conquistadors, which was marked by personal rivalries and chaotic governance, the establishment of the Viceroyalty of Peru in 1542 brought a degree of centralized order. This system allowed Spain to efficiently extract wealth from its colonies while maintaining a rigid hierarchy that benefited Spanish elites at the expense of the indigenous population. A key element of the colonial system was the exploitation of indigenous labor. Although the encomienda system had been formally abolished, it was soon replaced by the MITA system, a forced labor system adapted from Inca practices. Indigenous communities were required to send workers to Spanish mines and estates, particularly in Potosí, which became one of the richest silver-producing centers in the world. The wealth generated from these mines flowed into Spain, funding its European wars and making it one of the most powerful empires of the time. However, for indigenous laborers, the MITA system was nothing short of brutal. Overwork, malnutrition, and exposure to European diseases led to a dramatic decline in the native population, causing a demographic crisis that reshaped the social fabric of the Andes. The Spanish conquest also brought profound cultural and religious changes to the region. The forced imposition of Catholicism led to the suppression of indigenous religions and the destruction of many sacred Inca sites. Temples, such as the Coricancha in Cuzco, were converted into churches, symbolizing the spiritual conquest that paralleled the military takeover. However, while the Spanish sought to erase Andean religious traditions, indigenous communities found ways to preserve their beliefs through syncretism, blending Catholic and native traditions. This fusion can still be seen in Peru today, where indigenous religious practices remain intertwined with Catholicism. Another major consequence of Pizarro's conquest was the Spanish social hierarchy imposed on Peruvian society. The colonial caste system placed Spaniards and their descendants, Peninsulars and Criollos, at the top, while indigenous people, mestizos, and African slaves occupied lower positions. This rigid racial and social structure led to centuries of discrimination and marginalization, the effects of which persist in contemporary Latin America. The indigenous population, which had once been part of a powerful empire, found itself reduced to a subjugated class, stripped of political power and autonomy. Despite Spanish dominance, indigenous resistance to colonial rule never fully ceased. After the execution of Atahualpa and the collapse of the Inca government, some Inca nobles fled into the remote jungles of Vilcabamba, where they established a neo-Inca state that resisted Spanish rule until 1572, when the last Inca ruler, Tupac Amaru, was captured and executed. Even after the fall of Vilcabamba, numerous uprisings occurred throughout the colonial period. The most famous of these was the rebellion of Tupac Amaru II in 1780, an indigenous-led revolt against Spanish rule that, while ultimately unsuccessful, inspired later independence movements in South America. Pizarro's conquest also had significant global economic consequences. The vast quantities of gold and silver extracted from Peru fueled Spain's dominance in Europe, financing its wars and expanding its influence. However, the influx of American silver also contributed to inflation and economic instability, a phenomenon known as the price revolution. By the 17th century, Spain's economic power had begun to decline, even as its American colonies remained sources of immense wealth. The exploitation of Peru's natural resources would continue under colonial rule, benefiting the Spanish elite while impoverishing the indigenous and mestizo populations. In addition to economic exploitation, Pizarro's conquest set a precedent for European imperialism in the Americas. The strategies used in Peru, alliances with indigenous factions, ruthless military tactics, and the strategic use of superior weaponry became models for future conquests. The Spanish crown applied similar approaches in other parts of South America, extending its influence across the continent. The conquest of Peru demonstrated that small European forces, when equipped with advanced technology and aided by internal divisions within indigenous societies, could overthrow even the most powerful native empires. Despite the destruction and suffering caused by Pizarro's conquest, his legacy remains deeply embedded in Peruvian history. He is both revered and reviled, seen by some as a founder of modern Peru and by others as a symbol of colonial oppression. The city of Lima, which he founded in 1535, remains the capital of Peru, and his remains are interred in the Cathedral of Lima, where they continue to spark historical debate. His legacy is a reminder of the complex and often painful past that shaped the identity of Peru and the broader Andean region. The conquest led by Francisco Pizarro was more than just a military victory. It was an event that reshaped the entire continent, setting in motion centuries of colonial rule, economic exploitation, and cultural transformation. While his ambition and determination secured Spanish rule over the Andes, the consequences of his actions continue to be felt today. The Spanish conquest of the Inca Empire, initiated by Francisco Pizarro, marked the beginning of a long period of colonial rule that would endure for almost 3 centuries. Yet, Despite the Spanish crown's initial dominance and the profound changes it brought to the Andean region, the forces of rebellion and resistance never fully disappeared. By the early 19th century, the winds of independence were blowing throughout Latin America, fueled by Enlightenment ideals, the example of successful revolutions elsewhere, and a growing sense of national identity among colonized peoples. The story of Peru's path to independence is deeply intertwined with the legacy of Pizarro's conquest, and this final chapter explores how this legacy influenced the struggle for freedom and shaped the course of Peruvian history. The foundation of Spanish colonial rule in Peru, laid by Pizarro and his contemporaries, created a society marked by deep social, racial, and economic divisions. The Spanish imposed a rigid caste system, placing themselves at the top while relegating indigenous people, Afro-descendants, and mestizos to the lower echelons of society. This inequality would fuel resistance movements throughout the colonial period, even as Spain's grip on the Americas seemed unshakable. The legacy of these divisions was a deep sense of injustice, which contributed to the fervent desire for change among various sectors of the population by the early 1800s. The rise of independence movements in the Americas during the 19th century was influenced by a variety of factors, including the French Revolution and the American Revolution, which espoused ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity. These ideals found resonance among the colonists of Spanish America, particularly as Spain's political and economic power began to wane in the face of Napoleon Bonaparte's conquests in Europe. In 1808, Napoleon's invasion of Spain led to the capture of King Ferdinand VII, creating a power vacuum and fueling political instability across Spanish colonies. This disruption provided the perfect opportunity for colonies like Peru to challenge their colonial rulers. Initially, Peru remained loyal to the Spanish crown, even as revolutionary movements began to erupt across South America. The Viceroyalty of Peru, the center of Spanish power in the region, was an important and strategic territory for Spain. Yet, the growing sense of independence and the aspirations of the colonists could not be contained forever. The first significant signs of unrest came in 1811, when José de la Rivera led an unsuccessful revolution against Spanish rule, establishing the Peruvian Republic in Lima. While his government was short-lived, it symbolized the beginning of organized resistance to Spanish authority in Peru. By 1820, the situation in Peru had changed significantly. Other regions of South America, including Argentina, Chile, and Colombia, had gained independence from Spain, and their success inspired those within Peru who sought to break free from colonial rule. The arrival of Simón Bolívar, the celebrated leader of the South American independence movement, played a pivotal role in Peru's final push for freedom. Bolívar, supported by a coalition of local revolutionaries, launched an offensive against Spanish forces in the region. Bolívar's vision was not only for an independent Peru, but also for a united South America, a vision that would later prove difficult to realize, but one that guided the continent's early struggles for self-determination. One of the most decisive moments in Peru's path to independence occurred in 1821, when the Spanish forces, weakened by internal conflicts and external pressures, were finally driven out of Lima. Bolívar declared the independence of Peru, and the following years saw intense battles between royalist forces loyal to Spain and the Revolutionary Army, led by Bolívar and his followers. The Battle of Ayacucho, fought on December 9, 1824, was the defining moment in the War for Independence. In this battle, the Spanish forces were decisively defeated, and the last remnants of Spanish power in South America crumbled. The victory at Ayacucho secured Peru's independence, but the struggle for national identity and unity was far from over. The enduring legacy of Pizarro's conquest continued to shape Peru's post-independence era. The social and racial divisions created by Spanish colonialism persisted long after the colonial regime had fallen. Despite the victory over the Spanish, the country faced significant challenges in creating a cohesive national identity. The division between Creoles, descendants of Europeans, and mestizos, those of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, continued to fuel political and social tension. Additionally, the indigenous population, which had been subjugated for centuries under colonial rule, found itself marginalized in the newly independent nation. The promise of liberty and equality was slow to materialize for these communities, many of whom remained trapped in cycles of poverty and disenfranchisement. Furthermore, the newly independent Peru faced economic instability. The extraction of resources, particularly silver from Potosi, had been the backbone of colonial Peru's wealth, but independence meant that Peru could no longer rely on Spanish colonial systems. The country's economy struggled to adapt to a new system, exacerbated by a lack of infrastructure and ongoing political instability. The nation faced numerous economic crises, and the wealth of the colonial elite, which had been built on exploitation, was slow to be redistributed among the population. In the long term, Pizarro's legacy can be seen in the complex tapestry of Peru's history, one of exploitation, resistance, and transformation. Although the independence movement eventually succeeded in removing Spanish rule, the systems of social and economic inequality that Pizarro helped to establish endured in various forms. The deep scars left by centuries of colonialism did not disappear overnight, and they continued to influence the development of the country for many years. The story of Francisco Pizarro and his conquest of the Inca Empire is a pivotal chapter in the history of the Americas. While his actions set the stage for Spanish colonial rule, they also laid the foundation for centuries of resistance, struggle, and change. The legacy of Pizarro's conquest continues to be a subject of debate and reflection in modern Peru, where the wounds of colonization have not fully healed. As the country continues to navigate its identity in the post-colonial era, Pizarro's legacy serves as a reminder of the complex and often painful history that shaped not only Peru, but the entire South American continent. The history of colonialism, rebellion, and the quest for independence will remain central to understanding the social and political dynamics of the region for generations to come.